There is an animal standing at the edge of the African savanna right now, in the last light of a long day, reaching up into the crown of an acacia tree with a tongue that is almost half a meter long, eating leaves that no other large mammal on the ground below can reach. The giraffe is the tallest animal on Earth, and its neck alone is longer than most humans are tall. But here is the thing that science quietly wrestled with for centuries and only recently began to resolve. The neck may not have evolved primarily for feeding at all. There is another reason, one that involves the violence of male combat, the physics of a swinging head, and a social selection pressure so intense that it may have driven one of the most dramatic anatomical changes in the history of large mammals. Tonight we will follow the giraffe gently through that story, through the biology of a body that defies ordinary engineering, through a heart the size of a basketball pumping blood uphill against gravity, through the strange and tender social world of a savanna giant that most of us have watched, but few of us have truly understood. So close your eyes to everything but this. Let the warmth settle around you like the last light on the savanna, and drift with me toward the tall shape at the tree line, standing perfectly still, listening to the night coming in. Charles Darwin was honest about the giraffe. In On the Origin of Species, he offered the long neck as an example of natural selection's action, arguing that ancestors with longer necks could reach higher foliage and therefore survived better during food scarcity. The explanation was elegant, intuitive, and logical. It was also, for a long time, almost entirely unquestioned. The giraffe's neck became one of the canonical textbook examples of adaptation, the go-to illustration of natural selection, producing a perfectly functional structure for a perfectly clear purpose. And then, slowly, across decades of field observation and comparative biology, researchers began to notice that the textbook story was not fitting the data as neatly as it should. The feeding competition hypothesis, as it came to be called formally, predicts several things that should be true if it drove neck elongation. First, giraffes should use their height advantage to feed at heights inaccessible to other browsers, spending most of their time with their heads raised and exploiting the upper canopy. Second, longer-necked giraffes should have better body condition and survival rates, particularly during the dry season when food competition is most intense. Third, the relationship between neck length and survival should be stronger in females who bear the nutritional cost of pregnancy and lactation and therefore experience the sharpest nutritional competition. When researchers actually tested these predictions in the field, the results were surprising. Giraffes spend the majority of their feeding time with their necks held at intermediate heights, not stretched to maximum reach. Females and males have necks of similar proportional length relative to body size, and the longest-necked individuals do not show consistently better survival or body condition in the studies that have measured these variables. The textbook story was fraying at the edges. What the field data did show quite clearly was a pattern that pointed toward a different evolutionary driver. Male giraffes fight each other using a behavior called necking, in which two males stand side by side and swing their heads and necks like pendulums, attempting to deliver powerful blows to their opponent's body with the weight of the skull and the ossicones, the horn-like knobs on the head. These fights can be extremely intense, and larger, longer-necked males consistently win them. Males with longer, heavier necks deliver more powerful blows, sustain less damage from incoming strikes because they can swing with greater force, and win access to females in breeding condition. The reproductive advantages of neck length in males are directly and clearly measurable in terms of mating success, and they operate through a mechanism entirely separate from feeding. This is sexual selection, the same evolutionary force that produced the peacock's tail and the elk's antlers, and the evidence that it has been a major driver of giraffe neck evolution is now strong enough that most researchers in the field consider it at least as important as, and possibly more important than, the feeding competition story. The coexistence of two possible explanations for the same anatomical feature is not unusual in evolutionary biology, and the current scientific consensus on giraffe neck evolution is not that one explanation is entirely right and the other entirely wrong, but that both selection pressures probably contributed to neck elongation at different points in the lineage's history and in different sexes. The sexual selection hypothesis generates particularly clear predictions. If male competition for mates drove neck elongation primarily, male necks should be longer and heavier than female necks relative to body size, and male neck musculature should be more developed than female neck musculature. Careful anatomical studies have confirmed both of these predictions. Male giraffe necks are proportionally longer than female necks and contain substantially more muscle mass, consistent with a neck that has been shaped by combat selection in addition to whatever feeding-related selection acts on both sexes. The two sexes are, in this sense, carrying evidence of their different selective histories in the proportions of the same structure. The fossil record of the giraffe lineage provides a third line of evidence relevant to the neck debate. The okapi, the giraffe's closest living relative and one of the few surviving members of the Giraffidae family, has a much shorter neck than the giraffe and has a body plan closer to what the common ancestor of the two species likely looked like. Extinct members of the giraffe family discovered in the fossil record show a range of neck lengths, and the transition from shorter-necked ancestors to the dramatically elongated neck of the modern giraffe occurred over millions of years in the African Miocene and Pliocene, a period of substantial climate change that reduced forest cover and expanded open savanna habitats. Both feeding competition in a more open, browse-limited environment and intensifying male-male competition in a social system that required long-distance visibility and powerful combat would have been operating simultaneously during this transition, making the fossil record consistent with a dual-driver story rather than a clean single-cause explanation. What makes the giraffe neck question so enduringly interesting, beyond its specific biological resolution, is what it reveals about how evolutionary explanations are built and tested. Darwin's feeding competition story was not wrong in the sense of being internally incoherent or biologically implausible. It was incomplete, failing to account for the full pattern of variation and the full range of selection pressures acting on the animal. Science's revision of the story over the decades since Darwin is not a failure of the original hypothesis, but an example of the normal functioning of empirical inquiry, with each generation of researchers testing the predictions of existing explanations against new data and finding as often as not that the truth is richer and more multiple than any single elegant story can contain. The giraffe's neck is longer for more than one reason, and that, in the end, is a more interesting answer than any single reason alone could be. Building a viable giraffe requires solving a set of engineering problems that would challenge any designer working from scratch, and the solutions that evolution has found to these problems are distributed across almost every organ system in the animal's body. The cardiovascular challenge alone is formidable. The heart must pump blood upward through roughly 2 meters of neck to supply the brain, working against a gravitational pressure head that no other terrestrial mammal's heart must overcome. The blood pressure required to maintain adequate cerebral perfusion in a standing giraffe must be roughly twice that of a similarly sized mammal with a normal neck, and the heart and vascular system must generate and sustain this pressure continuously across a lifetime. The nervous system must manage the abrupt pressure changes that occur when the animal lowers its head to drink, dropping it rapidly from the full standing height to ground level and back again, without causing the blood pressure surges and drops that would be immediately dangerous in a less adapted animal. The giraffe's heart addresses the pressure requirement through both size and structural reinforcement. It is enormous by the standards of terrestrial mammals, typically weighing between 10 and 12 kilograms, roughly the size and weight of a large watermelon, with walls, particularly the left ventricular wall, that are exceptionally thick relative to the heart's overall dimensions. This wall thickness is not hypertrophy in the pathological sense seen in humans with chronic high blood pressure, but a developmental adaptation that produces a heart capable of sustaining the roughly 280 mmHg crown systolic blood pressure at the heart level required to deliver adequate perfusion pressure at brain level after the blood has climbed 2 meters against gravity. The blood pressure at the level of the giraffe's feet, where the blood has traveled the full height of the animal and the hydrostatic pressure has added to the cardiac output, is even higher, and the blood vessels of the lower legs are correspondingly thick-walled and reinforced to prevent fluid from leaking into the tissues and causing the severe edema that would otherwise result. The counter-pressure system that protects the giraffe's lower legs from edema has been studied with interest by researchers working on human medical problems, particularly the development of compression garments for conditions involving leg edema. The skin of the giraffe's lower legs is extremely tight and inelastic, functionally equivalent to a compression stocking wrapped around the entire lower limb, and this tight skin mechanically resists the outward pressure of the blood in the capillaries, preventing fluid from being pushed out of the blood vessels into the surrounding tissue. The giraffe essentially solves the problem of extremely high hydrostatic pressure in the legs by wearing anatomical compression garments that it has been born with. And the engineering principle has direct applications to human medicine in ways that researchers have been exploring for several decades. When the giraffe bends its neck to drink, the cardiovascular system faces a different but equally challenging problem. As the head descends, blood could potentially rush into the neck veins and cause a pressure surge in the brain, while as the head rises again, blood could drain away rapidly and cause a pressure drop. Either event, occurring abruptly in a less adapted animal, would cause fainting or worse. The giraffe manages this through a combination of mechanisms, including a specialized network of blood vessels called the rete mirabile, a wonder net of fine arterial channels at the base of the skull that acts as a pressure dampener, smoothing out the pressure fluctuations associated with head movements. Valves in the neck veins prevent blood from flowing backward when the head is lowered. The elastic walls of the major neck arteries absorb some of the pressure surge of head lowering and release it gradually. And the nervous system makes active adjustments to heart rate and vascular resistance in anticipation of and in response to head movements, managing the cardiovascular dynamics of head position changes with a precision that is only beginning to be fully characterized. The giraffe's respiratory system faces its own set of challenges imposed by the long neck. The trachea, the airway leading from the nose and mouth to the lungs, must traverse the full length of the neck, which means that the dead space in the respiratory system the volume of air in the airway that is not involved in gas exchange because it never reaches the alveoli of the lungs, is enormously larger in the giraffe than in any comparable mammal. This large dead space means that a giraffe must breathe more deeply with each breath to ensure that sufficient fresh air reaches the lungs for adequate gas exchange, compensating for the large volume of stale air that must be moved through the trachea with every breath. Measurements of giraffe respiratory physiology have confirmed that they do indeed take deeper breaths at a slower rate than other mammals of comparable body size, a pattern consistent with the dead space management requirement imposed by the long neck. The lungs themselves are proportionally larger than those of comparable mammals, providing the exchange surface needed to support the animal's metabolic needs, despite the inefficiency imposed by the lengthy airway. The nervous system of the giraffe must manage the extraordinary sensory and motor demands of a head at the end of a 2-meter neck with the same basic neural architecture available to all mammals, and it does so through adaptations that include the longest recurrent laryngeal nerve of any animal on Earth. This nerve, which controls the muscles of the larynx and is therefore essential for vocalizations, swallowing, and breathing, takes a remarkably circuitous route in all mammals. Rather than running directly from the brain to the larynx, it descends from the brain down the neck, loops around the aorta in the chest, and then runs back up the neck to the larynx. In humans, this detour adds a few centimeters to the nerve's length. In the giraffe, whose aorta is in the chest several meters below the larynx, the recurrent laryngeal nerve is approximately 5 meters long in a large adult, traveling a distance nearly 10 times longer than the direct route would require. The nerve is the inherited consequence of an evolutionary history in which fish ancestors had a version of this nerve that ran a short loop around the gill arches, and as the neck elongated and the heart descended, the loop got longer and longer without ever being redesigned from scratch. The giraffe's 5-meter recurrent laryngeal nerve is a perfect example of evolution's inability to redesign from first principles, making do instead with modifications to an existing plan that sometimes produce solutions of startling inefficiency. If the giraffe's neck is the anatomical feature that captures most observers' attention, the tongue is the one that, on closer examination, deserves its own moment of appreciation. A giraffe tongue is approximately 45 to 50 centimeters long, making it the longest tongue of any land mammal in proportion to body size, and among the longest in absolute terms. Its color is a distinctive dark blue-gray to purple-black on the outer surface, a pigmentation that is thought to provide protection against the ultraviolet radiation that the tongue is exposed to during the long hours the giraffe spends feeding in direct tropical sunlight, reaching into tree crowns where the tongue is frequently exposed to direct UV. The inner surface of the tongue and the mucous membranes of the mouth are a more typical pink, suggesting that the dark pigmentation is specifically related to UV exposure rather than being a uniform characteristic of all oral tissue. The prehensile capability of the giraffe tongue is extraordinary. The tongue can wrap around branches and stems with a grip strength sufficient to strip leaves and twigs from acacia branches covered with thorns that would deter most other browsers. The muscular control of the tongue allows the giraffe to select individual leaves from among the thorns of an acacia branch, manipulating the branch with precision to access the most nutritious parts while avoiding the thorns, or at least minimizing the puncture damage they cause. The tongue is used in conjunction with the elongated mobile lips, which are also heavily muscularized and prehensile, to grasp and manipulate vegetation in ways that the relatively immobile lips of most mammals could not achieve. The combination of the long tongue and the prehensile lips gives the giraffe an oral food-gathering apparatus of considerable dexterity, capable of exploiting the nutritional resources of trees in ways that go well beyond simple reach. The saliva of the giraffe has properties that complement the thorn-resistant feeding strategy. It is thick, sticky, and produced in large quantities, coating the thorns of acacia branches as the tongue moves across them and reducing the sharpness of their penetration into the oral mucosa. The acidity of giraffe saliva is also unusually high, with an antimicrobial composition that helps manage the bacterial load introduced by the inevitable small wounds that thorn feeding inflicts on the tongue and mouth tissue. Giraffes are frequently observed licking their wounds after feeding on heavily armed acacia branches, and the properties of their saliva appear to support rapid healing of the minor abrasions that are an unavoidable cost of their primary food source. The whole oral system, from the length and prehensility of the tongue to the composition of the saliva to the toughness of the lip tissue, has been shaped as an integrated package for a very specific feeding challenge. The acacia trees that giraffes depend on most heavily are themselves the products of a long co-evolutionary relationship with their browsers, including giraffes, and the defenses these trees have evolved against browsing provide an interesting counterpoint to the giraffe's feeding adaptations. Many acacia species have thorns, but they also deploy chemical defenses in their leaves, particularly tannins, which are bitter, astringent compounds that reduce the palatability and digestibility of leaf material when consumed in large quantities. When an acacia tree is heavily browsed, it increases the tannin concentration in its leaves within minutes to hours, making subsequent feeding on the same tree less rewarding. Some acacia species have been found to release volatile chemical signals when damaged by browsing that are detected by nearby trees, which also increase their tannin concentrations in apparent anticipation of browsing pressure. This chemical early warning system, which remains somewhat controversial in the scientific literature, has been invoked to explain why giraffes move between trees when feeding rather than depleting a single tree, walking typically upwind or in directions that would not carry the chemical signals from a tree they have already browsed to the next tree they intend to visit. Whether giraffes are actively navigating around the warning signal or simply following a foraging pattern that happens to avoid over-browsed trees is an interpretive question, but the pattern of movement itself is real and measurable. The nutritional selectivity of giraffe feeding is another aspect of the tongue's role that extends beyond simple reach. Giraffes are highly selective feeders, choosing specific tree species, specific branches within a tree, and specific leaf ages and positions within a branch, based on nutritional content that varies with tree species, leaf age, season, and the tree's chemical defense state. They show strong preferences for the most nutrient-dense parts of the foliage, particularly the growing tips where protein and mineral content is highest, and they adjust their selectivity with the season, consuming a wider range of plant material during the dry season when their preferred food is less available. This nutritional intelligence guides the tongue's work in a continuous way, with the giraffe making feeding decisions at the level of individual leaves on individual branches that reflect a sophisticated real-time assessment of nutritional quality against the cost of accessing it through the thorns. The tongue also plays a role in giraffes' social and self-maintenance behavior that extends beyond feeding. Giraffes use the tongue to groom areas of their body accessible to it, particularly around the face, eyes, and nostrils. And mutual grooming between individuals, in which one animal licks the neck and head of another, is a social bonding behavior observed most commonly between mothers and calves, but occasionally between adult females as well. The long tongue's reach makes it effective for accessing areas that short-tongued animals would struggle to reach, and the care taken with facial and ocular grooming may be related to the giraffe's reliance on its large, prominently positioned eyes for the long-distance visual monitoring of predators across open savanna habitats. Keeping the eyes clean and free from debris and parasites may have particular functional importance for an animal whose primary anti-predator strategy depends on detecting threats early. Of all the surprising facts about giraffe biology, the one that tends to produce the most immediate response in people who encounter it for the first time is the duration of their sleep. Giraffes sleep less than almost any other mammal, averaging somewhere between 30 minutes and 2 hours of sleep per 24-hour period, with most of this sleep occurring in short bouts of only a few minutes each, scattered across the night. For comparison, humans typically sleep for 7 to 9 hours, cats for around 12 to 14, and koalas for approximately 22. The giraffe, with its few brief minutes of consolidated sleep each night, sits at the extreme low end of the mammalian sleep spectrum. And the reasons for this extreme sleep reduction are not fully understood, but are thought to involve a combination of the metabolic demands of digestion, the continuous vulnerability to predation, and possibly physiological constraints related to the difficulty of lying down and rising again safely. The posture in which giraffes sleep varies with the depth of the sleep state. During lighter sleep, giraffes remain standing, allowing their body weight to be passively supported by a locking mechanism in the legs that permits the limbs to remain extended without continuous muscular effort, similar to the stay apparatus used by horses for standing rest. In this standing rest posture, the neck is held loosely in a more relaxed angle than the fully alert posture, and the eyes may be partially closed. This standing sleep is easily disrupted by any disturbance, and the giraffe can transition from this state to full alert within seconds. Deep sleep, in which the giraffe is least responsive to disturbance and which is thought to involve the slow-wave neural activity associated with restorative sleep in other mammals, occurs in a characteristic lying posture in which the animal folds its legs beneath its body and bends its neck backward to rest its head on its own rump. This deeply folded posture allows the entire body to contact the ground and appears to be more metabolically and structurally restful than standing. But it carries a significant cost. A giraffe lying down requires several seconds to rise, and a giraffe rising from this position is highly vulnerable to predator attack during the awkward and time-consuming process of unfolding its enormous body. The rarity of deep sleep in giraffes is almost certainly related to this vulnerability. Each bout of deep sleep is a period of substantially increased predation risk, and the evolutionary pressure to minimize this risk would have favored reducing the time spent in deep sleep to the physiological minimum required. What that minimum is, and what physiological functions the brief deep sleep bouts serve that cannot be served by the longer periods of lighter standing rest, is a question that sleep researchers working on giraffes are still trying to answer. What is established is that giraffes in environments with higher predator densities show even shorter and more fragmented sleep than those in lower risk environments. a behavioral flexibility that suggests the sleep duration is actively managed in response to perceived risk, rather than being an inflexible physiological constant. The digestive demands of a giraffe's diet contribute to the pressure on sleep time through a different mechanism. Giraffes are ruminants, chewing cud in the same way as cows, sheep, and goats, regurgitating partially digested plant material from the first stomach chamber and rechewing it before swallowing it for further digestion. This rumination process occupies a substantial portion of a giraffe's time, occurring in periods when the animal is at rest but not asleep, with the characteristic rhythmic jaw movements of cud chewing visible for many hours each day. The long neck that must be held in a comfortable position for extended periods of rumination imposes its own constraints on resting posture. And the rumination schedule interacts with the sleep schedule in ways that may further limit the time available for consolidated sleep. A giraffe that must both ruminate and sleep in the hours of darkness is managing two incompatible activities in the same time window. The sleep research on giraffes has been complicated by the difficulty of monitoring free-ranging giraffes through the night in field conditions, and most of the detailed sleep data comes from studies of giraffes in captivity or from observations of wild giraffes that are limited by the observer's own ability to function through a night in the field. Recent technological advances, including the development of accelerometers small enough to attach to giraffe ossicones or incorporate into tracking collars, have begun to provide more continuous data on giraffe activity patterns through the full 24-hour cycle. And this data is beginning to refine the picture of when and how much giraffes sleep in their natural environment. What the data so far confirms is that giraffes are, by any mammalian standard, remarkable in the brevity and fragmentation of their sleep, managing to apparently function normally on what would be a severely sleep-deprived schedule by human standards. An observation that has attracted some interest from sleep medicine researchers curious about what the giraffe's sleep minimum can tell us about the essential functions that sleep serves across mammals. The question of whether giraffes dream or experience anything during their brief deep sleep bouts that resembles the REM sleep associated with dreaming in other mammals has not been definitively answered. Some researchers working on giraffe sleep have described behavioral observations during deep sleep that are consistent with REM activity, including small muscle movements, changes in breathing pattern, and what appear to be eye movements beneath the closed lids. If these observations reflect genuine REM sleep, then giraffes are compressing their full sleep architecture, both slow-wave deep sleep and REM sleep, into bouts of only a few minutes each, which would represent a remarkable compression of sleep biology relative to other mammals. Whether the brief deep sleep bouts of a giraffe are functionally equivalent to the longer deep sleep periods of other mammals, or whether they represent a genuinely different sleep physiology adapted to the animal's extreme time constraints, remains one of the more interesting open questions in comparative sleep biology. The ossicones of the giraffe, the horn-like protrusions on the skull that are unique to the giraffe family, are not horns in the sense of being made of keratin or bone projecting from the skull surface. They are ossified cartilage covered with skin and fur, fused to the skull, but initially separate in young animals, and consolidating into the skull over the first years of life. Male giraffe ossicones are typically thicker and heavier than female ossicones, and they continue to calcify and grow throughout the male's life, accumulating deposits of calcium and bone mineral that make them progressively heavier and more formidable as weapons. Old males may have substantially enlarged, misshapen ossicones that reflect decades of fighting, and the pattern of damage, the calcification of impact sites, the asymmetric thickening on surfaces most frequently struck, records the individual's fighting history as clearly as the rings of a tree record its growing history. The necking combat of male giraffes is one of the more spectacular and least frequently witnessed behavioral events in savanna ecology, partly because it is triggered by specific social conditions that do not arise every day, and partly because it occurs most intensely during the night hours when human observers are least active. Two males that encounter each other in the context of a receptive female or a disputed territorial boundary will begin with a period of parallel walking, moving side by side and assessing each other's size and condition. If neither withdraws from this assessment phase, the combat escalates to necking, with the animals positioning themselves in the parallel orientation that gives each the full swing arc of its neck, and delivering blows to the opponent's body with the full weight of the head and ossicones at the end of a 2-meter pendulum. The force generated by these blows can be heard at considerable distance, and the physical consequences can be significant. Males have been knocked off their feet by particularly powerful strikes, and injuries including bruising, cuts, and occasionally bone fractures have been documented from necking combat. The selection pressure that intense necking combat exerts on neck morphology is direct and measurable. Males with longer necks can deliver blows with a longer swing arc, generating more momentum at the point of impact. They can also reach over or around a shorter opponent's neck to strike areas of the body that a shorter-necked competitor could not target from the same position. And they can absorb incoming strikes better, having more neck length to absorb the impact vector before it reaches the skull. All of these advantages increase with neck length, creating a consistent selection pressure for longer, heavier necks in males that operates through competitive fighting success and directly through reproductive access to females. This selection is of the kind called sexual selection through male-male competition, and its operation in giraffes has been documented through studies that measure neck length, fighting success, and mating access in identified individual males across multiple years of field observation. The skull of the male giraffe is also shaped by the demands of combat in ways that go beyond the ossicones. The skull is disproportionately heavy relative to the skull of the female, with additional calcification and bone deposits concentrated in regions that experience repeated impact during fights. The forehead region, which is a primary impact surface during the head swing combat, shows the most pronounced thickening in mature males. Some researchers have proposed that the bizarre multi-lobe skull morphology that develops in old male giraffes, with pronounced bony protrusions and irregular calcified deposits across the skull surface, represents the accumulated outcome of bone remodeling in response to repeated impact forces over a lifetime of fighting. The skull of an old male giraffe is, in this interpretation, a biographical document, recording in bone the history of contests that determined his reproductive success and ultimately the genetic legacy he passed to his descendants. The connection between necking combat and neck evolution is supported by an interesting finding from the fossil record of the Giraffidae family. Extinct members of the giraffe family from the Miocene and Pliocene of Africa and Eurasia show a diversity of skull morphologies, including several species with elaborate, thickened, helmet-like skull ornamentation that appears to reflect combat-related selection in those lineages. The variety of combat-adapted skull forms across the extinct giraffes suggests that male-male combat was a consistent and important selective force across the family's evolutionary history, predating the extreme neck elongation of the modern giraffe lineage. Some of the extinct species had shorter necks than modern giraffes, but more pronounced skull weaponry, suggesting different evolutionary solutions to the problem of male combat in different lineages. The modern giraffe's solution, the elongated neck as both a weapon and a weapon platform, was one of multiple possible responses to the same selection pressure, and its success is measured in the giraffe's continued existence as the last surviving large member of a once diverse family. The female giraffe's relationship to the combat system is more indirect, but no less important. Females in giraffe populations preferentially associate with and mate with males that win fighting contests, a preference that amplifies the reproductive advantage of fighting success and strengthens the selection pressure for the traits that determine fighting outcomes. In a social environment where female mate choice consistently favors combat winners, any heritable trait that contributes to fighting success will spread rapidly through the population, and neck length, as one of the most important determinants of necking combat outcome, would be expected to evolve rapidly under this combined selection from male competition and female choice. The elegant feedback loop between female preference, male competition, and trait evolution is the same dynamic that Darwin described for peacock tails and bird of paradise plumage, operating in the giraffe through a less showy but functionally equivalent mechanism, in which the display is a power performance rather than a visual spectacle. The social life of giraffes has been characterized in the scientific literature as loosely structured, with the term fission-fusion applied to describe social groups that change composition frequently as individuals join and leave without the stable, bounded membership of a pride or pack. For a long time, this characterization was taken to imply that giraffes were relatively non-social animals without the complex social bonds found in more cohesive groups. More recent long-term field research, particularly studies conducted in the Serengeti and in Namibia using photo identification of individual giraffes and network analysis of social association patterns, has substantially revised this picture, revealing that giraffe social structure is considerably more organized and persistent than the fission-fusion label implied, and that giraffes maintain preferential social relationships with specific individuals that persist across years and that have measurable fitness consequences. The research that has most changed how scientists think about giraffe sociality comes from work by Zoe Muller and colleagues, who have used social network analysis to examine the structure of associations within giraffe populations in ways that reveal the underlying social architecture that casual observation of changing group compositions would miss. Network analyses reveal that individual giraffes are not randomly choosing their associates from day to day, but are consistently preferring specific partners, forming persistent dyadic bonds that are maintained across months and years, even as the composition of daily groups fluctuates. These persistent bonds are strongest between adult females, who form the most stable long-term associations in the population. Males show weaker bonds to other males and to females outside the breeding season, and their associations are more variable over time. The social architecture of the giraffe population is, in this framework, a network of preferential female-female bonds overlaid with a more dynamic set of male associations that intensify around breeding opportunities and relax at other times. The potential functions of these persistent female-female bonds have been the subject of considerable research interest. One well-documented benefit is cooperative predator vigilance. Groups of female giraffes with strong social bonds show coordinated anti-predator behavior, with individuals distributing their vigilance across the group and apparently sharing information about threats through postural and behavioral signals. A female that detects a potential predator and raises her head in the alert posture reliably induces nearby associated females to also raise their heads and scan, even if they have not themselves detected the threat. This social spread of vigilance information allows each individual in a well-bonded group to spend less time scanning personally, because the group collectively provides better threat detection than any individual could maintain alone. The fitness benefit of this cooperative vigilance is substantial, particularly for females with calves that are vulnerable to lion and leopard predation, and that require continuous monitoring of the surroundings. Grandmothers appear to matter in giraffe society in ways that are beginning to be appreciated through long-term demographic studies. Post-reproductive female giraffes, animals that are past the age of producing their own calves, have been observed maintaining preferential associations with their adult daughters and granddaughters, and the presence of these older females in a family group is associated with improved survival and reproductive success in their younger relatives. A pattern similar to what has been documented for post-reproductive female orcas and elephants. The specific mechanism through which post-reproductive grandmothers improve their descendants' fitness is not fully established in giraffes, but the leading hypothesis, by analogy with what has been studied more thoroughly in other species, involves the transmission of ecological and social knowledge accumulated across decades of experience. An old female giraffe that has navigated decades of the Serengeti's seasonal variation, predator-prey dynamics, and social landscape carries knowledge about water sources, safe travel routes, and predator behavior that her younger relatives lack, and the presence of this knowledge in the group network may provide an edge in the situations where experience matters most. The mother-calf bond in giraffes is the most intensely studied social relationship in the species, and provides the clearest picture of what emotional and cognitive investment looks like in this animal. Giraffe mothers are highly attentive to their calves, which are born at an already impressive height of approximately 1.8 meters after a 14 to 15-month gestation, and must be able to stand and walk within hours of birth to avoid predation from the lions, leopards, hyenas, and crocodiles that view giraffe calves as accessible prey. The first hours of a giraffe calf's life, during which it makes its initial attempts to stand and walk on legs that look improbably long and jointless, are among the more tense moments in savanna wildlife observation. And the mother's behavior during this period, her constant proximity, the way she positions herself between the calf and any approaching disturbance, and the low vocalizations she directs toward the calf, reflect a state of focused maternal vigilance that leaves little doubt about the functional depth of the bond. The question of whether giraffes are capable of something like grief, or whether the behavioral responses that observers have documented following the death of a calf represent an emotional state analogous to what that word implies in humans, is one that behavioral ecologists approach carefully, acknowledging both the interpretive difficulties and the genuine behavioral data. Female giraffes have been observed remaining with the body of a dead calf for extended periods, sometimes days, returning to it repeatedly and nudging it with the nose or standing over it in a protective posture. These behaviors have been documented in multiple independent studies across different populations and are consistent enough in their form and duration to be treated as a real behavioral pattern rather than individual aberrations. Whether the underlying state is accurately called grief or requires some different vocabulary that acknowledges the cognitive and emotional capacities of a non-human animal, while not uncritically mapping human emotional categories, is a question that animal behavioral science is actively debating. The behaviors themselves are not in dispute. The giraffe is not simply a passenger in the African savanna ecosystem. It is a structural component of it, shaping the vegetation, the soil, and the distribution of other species in ways that are only becoming fully visible as researchers examine the cascading effects of giraffe absence or presence across different habitat types. The most direct ecological role of the giraffe is as a browser of tall tree species, particularly acacias, that are inaccessible to other large herbivores. By pruning the upper canopy of these trees, giraffes regulate the height and density of tall woody vegetation in ways that affect light availability for understory plants, nesting site availability for birds, and the structure of the habitat for dozens of other species. In areas where giraffe populations have been reduced or eliminated, the acacia canopy tends to grow denser and taller, changing the nature of the habitat in ways that ripple through the community of species that depends on specific structural properties of the savanna. The role of giraffe urine and dung in nutrient cycling is another ecological service that is less obvious but measurably important. Giraffes consume large quantities of browse across wide areas, concentrating the nutrients from dispersed vegetation and depositing them in localized areas where the animals regularly rest or congregate. This nutrient redistribution, from the canopy level where the leaves are consumed to the soil surface where the dung is deposited, represents a vertical nutrient transfer that connects the upper canopy nutrient cycle to the soil nutrient cycle in a way that no other large herbivore replicates at the same height scale. Research on soil nutrient distributions in giraffe habitats has found elevated nitrogen and phosphorus levels in areas with high giraffe activity compared to similar areas with low giraffe presence. And these nutrient hotspots support higher densities of small herbivores, insects, and the predators that depend on them. The giraffe's feeding literally fertilizes the ground it walks on. Giraffes also modify the seed dispersal dynamics of the trees they feed on. Seeds consumed in the browse are sometimes passed through the digestive system intact, deposited in the dung in viable condition, often far from the parent tree. Seeds of some acacia species have been shown to have higher germination rates after passing through a giraffe's digestive system than unprocessed seeds, apparently because the digestive chemistry scarifies the seed coat in ways that improve germination. This seed dispersal service, combined with the physical dispersal of seeds over the distances the giraffe travels between feeding and resting areas, makes the giraffe an important vector for tree recruitment across the savanna, contributing to the genetic diversity and spatial distribution of tree populations in ways that would be difficult to replicate in its absence. The trees and the giraffes are in a relationship that goes beyond simple predator and prey, involving a mutual dependence that has been refined across millions of years of coevolution. The interaction between giraffes and the yellow-billed oxpeckers that routinely perch on their bodies provides another window into the savanna's ecological web. These birds feed on the ticks, parasites, and wound debris that accumulate on the giraffe's skin, providing a parasite reduction service that benefits the giraffe's health, while the giraffe's body provides both food and a platform for the birds. This relationship, which is an example of mutualistic symbiosis, is not passive on the giraffe's part. Giraffes allow oxpeckers access to areas of their body, including the face and around the eyes and ears, that would normally be defended against any physical contact, apparently tolerating the bird's attentions, because the health benefit of parasite removal outweighs the mild discomfort of the bird's sharp-beaked pecking. The giraffe's high position also gives the oxpeckers an elevated vantage point from which to scan for their own predators, and observations of oxpeckers issuing alarm calls that the giraffe responds to suggest a mutualism that may extend to shared vigilance beyond simple parasite removal. Water is a resource that the giraffe's anatomy makes physically challenging to access, and the problem of drinking deserves specific attention because it illustrates how the same anatomical features that confer advantage in one context create costs in another. To reach water at ground level, a giraffe must splay or bend its front legs dramatically, lowering its head from its normal height of up to 5 meters down to ground level in an awkward, unstable posture that exposes the animal to predator attack during the long seconds required to take a drink. Giraffes drink relatively infrequently, typically every few days, and they derive a significant fraction of their water needs from the moisture content of the leaves they consume, reducing their dependence on standing water sources and the vulnerability that accessing them entails. When they do drink, they do so with obvious alertness, frequently interrupting the drinking posture to raise the head and scan for predators, a behavior that reflects the real and well-documented predation risk of the drinking posture. Crocodiles in Africa have learned to use the predictability of giraffe drinking visits to water points as a hunting opportunity, and lions have been documented waiting in ambush near water sources used regularly by giraffes. The giraffe's long neck, so advantageous in so many contexts, becomes a specific liability at the water's edge, where the physics of reaching ground level with a head attached to a 2-meter neck require a compromise of stability and vigilance that no amount of evolution has been able to fully resolve. The thermal biology of the giraffe represents a final dimension of its relationship with the savanna environment that is worth dwelling on, because it illustrates how the long neck creates challenges and solutions simultaneously in the domain of body temperature regulation. The African savanna is a thermally demanding environment, with midday temperatures regularly exceeding 40 degrees Celsius in the dry season, and the large body of a giraffe generates substantial metabolic heat that must be dissipated to maintain a safe core temperature. The long neck provides an unusually large surface area for heat dissipation relative to the neck's volume, because a cylinder's surface area to volume ratio increases as the cylinder becomes longer and thinner, and the giraffe's neck is both longer and proportionally narrower than a sphere or cube of equivalent mass would be. The blood flowing through the neck's extensive vascular network loses heat to the surrounding air across this large surface, and the neck's position above the body, extended into the cooler, more ventilated air above the boundary layer, enhances this heat exchange further. Researchers who have modeled the thermoregulatory function of the giraffe neck have estimated that it contributes meaningfully to the animal's heat budget in hot conditions, suggesting that thermal advantage may be an additional selective benefit of neck length, supplementing the feeding and combat-related advantages already discussed. The giraffe's coloration also contributes to its thermal regulation in ways that are not immediately obvious. The distinctive reticulated pattern of darker polygons separated by lighter cream-colored lines, which varies in detail between individuals and between subspecies, is not simply camouflage, though it does provide some degree of visual disruption against the dappled light of acacia woodland. Each darker polygon corresponds to a region of skin with a denser underlying network of blood vessels, and thermal imaging studies of living giraffes have shown that these darker patches are sites of elevated surface temperature, actively radiating heat to the environment. The lighter lines between the patches correspond to regions with fewer surface vessels and lower surface temperatures, reducing the total heat loss from the skin surface in conditions where losing too much heat would be a problem. The pattern functions in this interpretation as a thermal mosaic, allowing fine-scale regulation of heat loss across the skin surface through the spatial distribution of areas with high and low vascular density. The giraffe does not simply radiate heat uniformly through its skin. It radiates it selectively, through a pattern that both the evolutionary history of its thermal regulation and the evolutionary history of its visual appearance have shaped simultaneously, in a single integrated skin architecture. The 9 subspecies of giraffe recognized in some taxonomic treatments, or the 4 full species recognized in a more recent genomic study that examined the genetic differentiation of populations across Africa, complicate the conservation picture by revealing that the apparently single-species giraffe actually encompasses multiple genetically distinct lineages, whose evolutionary histories, behavioral characteristics, and conservation statuses differ significantly. The northern giraffe populations, which include the reticulated giraffe of East Africa and the Nubian giraffe of East and Central Africa, are in a different conservation situation from the southern giraffe populations, which are more numerous and more stable. The Kordofan giraffe of Central Africa, with a population estimated at fewer than 2,000 individuals, is among the most endangered large mammal populations in Africa by any measure, and the conservation challenges it faces differ substantially from those of better-known populations with different geographies, habitats, and threat profiles. Treating giraffe conservation as a single problem obscures the varied and urgent situations of individual lineages that may be in precipitous decline, even as the aggregate species count appears more stable. The ecological consequences of giraffe decline extend beyond the loss of the species itself, given the ecological services described in the preceding section. Models of savanna ecosystem dynamics have shown that the removal of giraffes as the dominant tall canopy browser leads to predictable changes in tree size distribution, understory composition, and the community structure of species that depend on specific habitat features maintained by giraffe browsing. In areas where giraffe populations have been reduced substantially, these changes have been observed on the timescale of years to decades, providing empirical confirmation of the giraffe's keystone ecological role. The recovery of giraffe populations in areas where they have been successfully reintroduced, notably in several southern African countries where conservation and community-based management programs have produced population increases in recent decades, demonstrates that the decline is not irreversible where appropriate conditions and protections can be established. The involvement of local communities in giraffe conservation has emerged as one of the more important factors in the success or failure of conservation programs across Africa. In areas where local communities derive tangible economic benefit from the presence of wildlife, including giraffes, through tourism revenue and community conservation programs, the political and practical support for wildlife management is stronger and the poaching pressure lower than in areas where wildlife represents a cost without corresponding benefit. The Giraffe Center in Nairobi, Kenya, which breeds Rothschild's giraffes for reintroduction to protected areas and receives hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, is among the most visible examples of how conservation breeding programs and wildlife tourism can be combined to generate both conservation outcomes and the community support that makes those outcomes sustainable. The long-term success of giraffe conservation across Africa will depend on replicating and expanding these linkages between community interest and wildlife persistence across the full geographic range of the species. And through all of this, the giraffe continues. On the savannas, where its numbers are stable or recovering, it moves in the unhurried way of an animal that has found its place in the world and occupies it with a completeness that needs no commentary. In the early morning light, when the mist is still lying along the low places and the acacia trees are dark against the brightening sky, the long shape of the giraffe moves slowly through the landscape, reaching upward with the certainty of belonging, its neck a question that evolution answered in multiple languages over millions of years. The answer is still visible in the bones of every fight, in the length of every reach, in the social bonds of the females that move together through the years, in the calves that find their feet on legs that seem improbably long and then walk away from the place where they were born with all the equipment they need for a life on the savanna already built into them. The savanna is quiet now. The light has been gone for a while, and the giraffes are somewhere in the dark between the acacia groves, standing very still in the way that large, safe things stand at night, the long necks loose, the great eyes half closed, the ruminating jaw moving gently through its slow and patient work. They are not quite asleep, and they are not quite awake, and the night holds them lightly, the way a good night holds everything that does not need to be anywhere else. You have been tonight inside an evolutionary argument that lasted millions of years and is still being written in the bones of every male that swings his neck in a contest no one but the two of them will ever fully see. You have been inside the cardiovascular physics of blood climbing 2 meters against gravity, inside the 5 meters of nerve that loops around the chest because evolution could not find a shorter route, inside the 20 minutes of sleep that is all a giraffe ever really takes. The giraffe carries all of this the way it carries its height, easily, without apparent effort, in the unhurried movement of an animal that has never needed to be in a hurry, because everything it needs is already up there, at the tips of the highest branches, in the place no one else can reach. Let your own neck relax now, gently against the pillow. Let the weight of everything settle the way the savanna settles after dark, in its own quiet layers. The giraffes are still out there, standing in the dark, and the acacia trees are full of leaves at the level where only they can reach. And somewhere in the slow blue African night, a calf is folded against its mother's legs, learning already what it means to be the tallest thing in the world. Good night.